How many of you are excited to be here this morning, this afternoon? Amen. Well, it sounds like you're awake and alive. That's good. I was joking with them earlier. I said I've had two things going on this week, both very time consuming, and both I'm having to put a lot of focus on. Practicing the lines for the play and trying to get notes together. And so I said, when I get up here, I hope my wires don't get crossed. Start spouting off the lines to the play, and then tomorrow I'll be teaching on the Torah portion. But so if it seems as if it's deviating a little, just hang on. It'll round back. It'll come back. And how many of you read your Torah portion this week? It was funny because we've been so busy. I think half the ones in our own didn't get a chance to, but that's okay, because we're going to talk about this week's Torah portion and what it means. The title is Metzorah, and it means leper. And it's one of these, quite honestly, it's a very difficult Torah portion. By the time you read, it's just two chapters, but by the time you read these two chapters, you walk away thinking, what in the world? How does this have anything to do with me? How do I apply this to my life? How does this affect my relationship with him? What's the practical value to this? And it's quite a perplexing ritual. We find that this Torah portion is dealing with how to cleanse the leper. And if we look at this merely from the view, that was back then, and it's dealing with a physical ailment. And obviously, I don't have leprosy, so therefore I really don't have to worry about this ritual. I don't have to worry about this cleansing, this process that's taking place. But what I found is that anytime Yahweh takes the time to put this in the Torah, make this part of his word, then obviously it has value for you and I. Because he doesn't just say things. He doesn't just spout off something. There's a reason that he put this here. And it's something that affects us. It's something that we need to understand, something that we need to know. And I found as I begin to look at this, we've become so separated from this idea of being one that's nidah, being one that's unclean. And we find that today, if we're unclean, it really doesn't affect us like it would have in the days of the tabernacle or the temple, where you were cut off. You couldn't come into his presence. You weren't allowed to come in to bring sacrifices, to bring offerings. You were completely removed and separated from everything else that was going on in the community. And when we begin to think like this, oh my goodness, spiritually, this is still in play. If we're unclean, if we're nidah, if we're ceremonially impure, we can't come before him. We've been cut off. And then all of a sudden, all these rituals of how we're cleansed, of how there's a restitution made, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more important, doesn't it? And as I begin to look at this one, the ritual of the cleansing of the leper, you walk away thinking, my goodness, because it seems to branch out and have similarities to several other complexing rituals as well. We find that when we read what the cleansing of the leper ceremony was like, it seems to be associated with the red heifer sacrifice. Because when you go back and look, my goodness, the red heifer sacrifice also called for cedar, scarlet, and hyssop. 3 things present in the cleansing of the leper. And when we look at the sacrifice of the red heifer, we know that the ashes were mixed with the water to cleanse someone that had come in contact with death, that was impure. So we find that, maybe does this have something to do with the cleansing of the leper? We look a little further and we find that 2 birds are used in the cleansing of the leper. One's killed and the other one's set free. And it sounds quite similar, especially the language that's being used as the Yom Kippur. The 2 goats, the lots being cast. One sacrificed, the goat of Yahweh, the other sent out into the wilderness. And yet we see it here, this same pattern, the same analogy with the leper. We look a little further and we find that after the leper, this ritual is taking place, that the priest was to apply the blood and the oil to the right earlobe, the thumb, and the big toe of the individual that was being cleansed. We look back, my goodness, that's how they anointed the priests. They applied the blood to the earlobe, to the thumb, and to the big toe of those that were being consecrated as operating as the priesthood. And so by the time we finish reading this, before we go any further, before we even begin to look at the language, we walk away quite perplexed. My goodness, what does this have to do with? It's seemingly branching out and touching all of these areas, but what is this doing? What is he trying to reveal to us? And as we begin to look at this passage, we have to first ask the question. With it branching out into all of these other very distinct areas, could this ritual of the cleansing of the leper have to do with him teaching us how to cleanse our temple. Because isn't it interesting that the ashes of the red heifer were required for that altar to be consecrated? Before it could ever be put into motion and be used as the altar of Yahweh, they had to cleanse it with the ashes of the red heifer. We understand this is a temple. We're supposed to be an altar. Do you think that maybe he's about to teach us some principles, some concepts of how he wants to cleanse this altar? Of how he wants to cleanse this temple? Of how we can become a people that remain kafared, to be covered, to be kapured. And we understand when we look at that word kafar, it doesn't just mean that he's going to cover your sin. He's not just going to cover the leprosy, hide it, put something over it, sweep it under the rug. But it literally means to change the very nature of an individual. Do you think that maybe he's about to teach us of how he's going to change us from that of a sinful, carnal individual that brings forth fruit that leads to death, as we're told in Romans 7:5, to becoming an individual that walks in righteousness in order to operate as that kingdom of priests, which is what Israel's supposed to be unto Yahweh. So it seems before we ever even begin to delve into the language, just these connections, these little dots that we're being given, when we read in the English, it looks as if maybe this ceremony of the cleansing of the leper has to do with teaching us the transition from walking after the flesh to becoming a group of individuals that would walk after the Spirit. Amen? Isn't it interesting that that seems to be the whole theme, the whole focus? No matter who you talk to or what you're talking about, it always seems to go back to the fact, where's the power? Where's his presence? Where's the miracles? We understand and know we should be walking in these things, but we're not. And so the question becomes, where's the disconnect? And I believe that this Torah portion is beginning to shed some light onto these things. He's teaching us that in order to walk in that level of power, that level of authority, in order to see him like they saw him, that it's going to require us to go through these rituals. It's going to require us to be transformed from an individual that would walk after the carnal, fleshly man to one that would walk after the Spirit and bring forth the fruit of the Spirit. And that's why I was so thankful that the praise and worship this morning. When you read this Torah portion, I'll be honest, it's very difficult to get this direction, but that's where he took it. And then to hear the songs that were chosen, it's a second confirmation for me because it's all about sacrificing. It's all about surrendering what we want, who we are, our desires, the things that we say are important, and saying, no, I'm going to do what you said. No, I'm going to allow you to be the one that directs my steps. No, I'm going to allow you to produce the fruit in me that you want produced in me, and I surrender to allow that to happen in my life. Now, as we begin to look at this, there's some interesting things. The sages teach that this whole passage, this Torah portion that's dealing with the cleansing, not only of a leper, but it's also dealing with the cleansing of one that would go through childbirth, of one that would be nidah, ritually unclean. There's a time of cleansing. There's certain steps they have to go through. The sages have noted and teach that this passage is actually mirroring the same process that Israel went through when they came out of Egypt. Because there's certain time frames that you're given. There's certain steps that you have to go through. And they teach that, oh my goodness, it looks as if Israel, when they're being brought out of Egypt, is going through this same process. There's a certain amount of days that they're camped here. Then they have to go through the waters that cleanse. And they come out on the other side and they see that there's this parallel that's taking place. And so when we look at this, I thought, my goodness, isn't it interesting? Because here we find ourselves, we're right on the cusp of Passover, aren't we? Right now, everyone's focus is on cleaning the house, getting the leaven out, preparing to bring the lamb in, preparing to enter into this divine appointment. And we find that when we deal with Passover, we're being reminded we're telling the story of them coming out of Egypt. This process that they go through when Yahweh delivers his people. And we find that this Torah portion is reminding you of the same thing. There's a process that you're going to go through because what he did back in Egypt wasn't the end. There's a future, even greater exodus, and it's going to mirror the same process. And we find that as we begin to look at this Torah portion regarding the leper, he's teaching you this is the process you're going to go through. This is how you're going to be brought from one that was in bondage in Egypt, one that was ruled by their flesh, and you're going to become Yashar El. You're going to become Israel, the ones that would stand upright before him. And it's going to require us to go through this process. There's certain steps that we're going to go through. And as I began to look at this, I had to ask the question, what is leprosy? Because as long as we look at it from our English viewpoint, a skin disease, something in the flesh, physical, we're not really going to be able to understand how this is connecting to what he wants to do among his people until we begin to break this down. What does this leprosy represent? Was it something that he was using in the physical to teach Israel a deeper, significant spiritual meaning? And I believe it was. When we backtrack prior to this Torah portion, which by the way is normally a double portion and connected with last week's, but this year it is not. So when we backtrack and we look at what leads us into this portion, he begins to give some descriptions of how to spot leprosy. How to spot this, how to determine, is that leprosy or is it not? And in Leviticus chapter 13, verse 2, it says that when a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a rising, a scab, or a bright spot, and it be in the skin of his flesh like the plague of leprosy. And it goes on in this verse to describe the color that it would be and all of these things the priest is to look for. And then we find that individual is now shut up for 7 days to see what's going to happen. Is that going to spread? Or is it going to go away? Is it going to be dealt with? We need to look at some of these words because this is describing leprosy. It says that he shall look for a scab or a bright spot. The word scab in Hebrew begins to show us exactly what Yahweh is talking about, what he's referring to. The word scab is Strong's number 5597. In the Hebrew, it's sapachat, and it means an eruption, a scab, a lesion. And you may think, well, there you go, skin disease. It's dealing with the scab, a lesion on the skin of the flesh. But let's go a little further. It comes from the root sapak, Strong's number 5596, and it means to join to something, to attach to join together, and to abide in. So it seems that, well, maybe there's a little bit more to this terminology than meets the eye. Maybe being unclean, being outside the camp, being an individual that's marked as a leper has something to do with what we've chosen to be joined to, what we've chosen to attach to, what we've chosen to allow to abide in us. Well, let's break this down a little more. This word is spelled samek pei ket. The samek pei root forms the word sop, and it means a threshold, a doorway. And when you see this from the Near Eastern mindset, they understood that threshold was symbolic. It was important. Whenever something was allowed to cross the threshold, it was symbolic of you now entering into covenant with whoever or whatever had crossed your threshold. And so now we can begin to understand that when we're dealing with leprosy, this idea of something that would make you unclean, something that would put you outside of the camp and cut you off from Yahweh, he's beginning to teach us, how do we spot this? It has to do with something that we allow ourselves to be joined to, and we allow it to cross our threshold. We allow it to enter into covenant with us. Do you think that maybe that's why we're being reminded and being honed in, guarding the threshold, guarding the gateways? What we're allowing to cross this threshold has the potential to make us unclean. What we're allowing to cross the threshold into our homes has the potential to make our homes unclean. And he's reminding us that to guard the threshold, watch it, inspect what's coming across, because whatever you're allowing in, you've now entered into covenant with it. Let's look a little bit further. The second part of this word sapak, the first being the samek pei, but the second half is the pei ket. It's translated as meaning a bird trap or a snare. And so when I saw this, my goodness, it seems as if he's beginning to connect some of these dots together, that leprosy is dealing with more than just a rash. It is more than just a skin infection. It's actually dealing with, he's teaching us a concept that when we allow ourselves to be joined together in covenant with something, it has the potential to make us unclean. But once it crosses the threshold and it's in the house, we've now find ourselves trapped. We fell for the trap. The snare's been set and you've been caught because it's in the house. And so when he's beginning to deal with leprosy, he's reminding the children of Israel, guard the gateways, Guard your threshold. What you choose to entertain has the potential to become a trap. You may find yourselves in a covenant that you'd rather not be in. Let's look a little bit further. He then says, if it's a bright spot that's in the skin, it may be leprosy. The word bright spot is boharet, and it means a bright spot, a blister, or a boil. And you'll find that it's only used here describing leprosy. But the interesting thing is that when you look at this word in the Hebrew, it's spelled beit, hey, resh, tav. The letter beit often acts as a prefix, and it means in. But what's the root? The hey, resh, tav. Well, according to the Klein's etymological dictionary, it's translated as meaning the womb, much like the word hara deals with being pregnant, seed being planted in the womb. So when you see this word bright spot, boharet, the beit prefix meaning in, this word could literally be translated as meaning in the womb. Spiritual leprosy is dealing with us allowing something to cross the threshold, seed being planted in the womb, entering in covenant with the counterfeit, and we find that the results are that we actually find ourselves ensnared. We actually find ourselves in bondage because we didn't inspect what we allowed to come into the house. And so it's interesting that before he ever begins to deal with how you can be cleansed from leprosy, he teaches you how to look for it. What causes it? What would cause his people to be unclean, to be cut off from him? What would cause his people to continue in this state of trapped, ensnared? And we find that he's reminding them that whatever they allow to entertain, whatever they allow to come across their threshold, that's what has the potential to keep them in bondage. Isn't it interesting that this is right before Passover? He's reminding you, what's Passover about? It's about coming out of bondage. It's about coming out of Egypt. It's about being set free, having a jubilee, being restored, being redeemed, bought out of that. And yet he reminds us that if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves right back in that same situation if we don't guard the threshold. And as we look at this from our vantage point today, we can see and understand that it seems that the majority of the time we spend more of our effort and more of our time dealing with the fruit off of this issue. When this thing grows and it begins to multiply and we're having all kinds of issues and calamities that are overwhelming us, we spend all of our time dealing with the results. We spend all of our focus, all of our energy dealing with the results of that seed being planted. And we spend a lot of effort doing damage control. And yet he's reminding us that as long as we're doing damage control, but we're not cutting off the access point, it becomes this vicious cycle. Again and again, we get out of bondage. We experience this jubilee, this Shemitah year, being set free, but yet we didn't guard the threshold. We didn't cut it off. We allowed this door to remain open. And so what happens? It goes right back. Seeds planted again. Another harvest comes up. All the effort, all the energy is spent on dealing with the harvest. And yet he's reminding you, close the door. Guard the threshold. Inspect what you're allowing to come in. And then when you're set free, you can actually stay free. Let's look at the word for flesh. It says, look for a scab or a bright spot in the flesh. The word flesh here is Strong's number 1320. It's the word basar. And it's translated as meaning flesh, but this word comes from a root which has some very interesting connotations. It's the word basar as well, and it means to bear good news, to publish, to preach, to show forth, to announce salvation. In fact, some of you are probably familiar with one of the versions of scriptures called the Metzorah, the good news. Do you realize that your lifestyle, your flesh, your walk, who you are, should be publishing and announcing and sharing the good news of the Torah? In fact, the sages teach that each of you is responsible for writing your own Torah scroll. And the way we're writing our own Torah scroll is the way that we're living our life, the way we're walking this out. Every day as we walk out these commandments, as we walk out this relationship with him, you're writing your own Torah, your Metzorah. And now we can look at this. Oh my goodness, leprosy is, we're specifically told, it's dealing with the flesh. It's affected your Torah. It's affected your walk. It's affected whatever you're choosing to proclaim. It's affected the good news that you're supposed to be showing forth. So we find then that leprosy has to do, obviously, with an individual that is failing to walk in this manner. That maybe their lifestyle isn't exactly proclaiming the good news of the Torah. And we find it's as if that their lifestyle now instead is declaring who they've been entertaining. There's a switch. Instead of declaring that they've been in the presence of Yahweh, that it's his word that's planted, now their steps are being directed by that. Instead, we find their lifestyle begins to proclaim that they've entertained a counterfeit, and we find that they begin to walk after their flesh instead of the Spirit. And it's declared in their walk. It's declared in their household. It's declared by the fruit that they begin to bear. Some evidence begins to be seen. And I want to issue a disclaimer. This doesn't mean that anytime you happen to be going through something, through troubled times, that, oh, you're in sin. That's why you're going through that. You open the door and you're in sin and you shouldn't be doing that. That's not what this is about. But what he's beginning to teach us is that what is happening is that when you are put in situations and you are put into these times where it seems that things aren't going your way and you're being stretched and you're being refined and purified, that how you handle that situation. That's what he's watching. Things are going to happen. Waves are going to come across and attempt to bring you under. But the way you walk out this walk, the way you handle it, that becomes the telltale sign that he's looking for, because that's where the fruit's going to become evident. What kind of fruit's being born? Amen. So as we begin to look at this, we realize that when he's bringing them out of Egypt, they're going through this process, this cleansing process. They're unclean. Their threshold was compromised. So now they've got to go through this process of cleansing the leper to be Israel, to be those that would stand upright, those that would walk after the Spirit. And we find that he's watching them as they go through this. In fact, coming out of Egypt really wasn't that hard. We find that when they get in the wilderness, he begins to inspect what kind of fruit they're going to bear. He deals with the threshold issue. Why do you think the blood of the lamb is applied to the doorposts? A threshold covenant's entered into. The threshold is now purged and cleaned. Now, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to allow the same junk to come right back in the house and cause you to bear the same fruit of bondage? Or are you going to begin to walk after the Spirit and begin to allow your lifestyle, your walk, to be declaring the Torah? So we find this pattern begins to show us and teach us that being cleansed from leprosy is actually teaching us how to renew our minds. It's teaching us how to become an individual that would take our thoughts captive, that would deal with our flesh, that would circumcise our hearts, that would learn to guard our thresholds, the womb of our mind, and becoming an individual that would actually walk out the Torah, walking in the Spirit, developing and producing the fruit of the Spirit, proclaiming the good news. And it would become evident by our lifestyle. It would become evident by the way we carry ourselves. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, I believe this is what the Apostle Paul was referring to. He's admonishing them to cast down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of Yahweh, and bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Messiah. Why? Because this is a threshold. And the moment we choose to entertain these things and we don't cast it down, that seed's been planted in the womb. And now we find that seed's going to grow. And that seed may look really small and seem as, well, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that bad. And yet we find that it can grow quite a lot, and it can produce 100-fold fruit. And so as we begin to look at this, do you realize that maybe this has something to do with what he's trying to do in the body as a whole now? Do you think that maybe he's trying to teach us to walk in this manner, to learn to walk after the Spirit, to learn to produce the type of fruit that's evident that we've spent time with him instead of someone else? That maybe if we would begin to do that, do you think that we might see some changes? Do you think that maybe that's the disconnect? That maybe the moment that we choose to get ourselves out of the way, that then we will begin to see the miraculous again. Then we would begin to see the power. Do you realize that when Israel came out of Egypt, the fear of Yahweh fell upon all the surrounding nations because they saw and they knew surely Yahweh is with them. They saw the miracles. They saw the plagues poured out. They saw the judgment, and they realized that the hand of Yahweh was upon that people. Why? Because the fruit was evident. They didn't have to tell them, just look what happened. All you got, there's the evidence. And so we find this process of being brought out of Egypt was teaching Israel how to deal with their flesh, how to deal with the threshold, how to become a people that would walk after the Spirit, that would choose to walk out the Torah. And we find that when they chose to do that, Yahweh began to show his mighty wonders in the earth. And isn't it interesting that it seems that maybe, just maybe, that's the point that we find ourselves at today as well. We find ourselves, the calls going forth, come out of her, my people, come out of Babylon. We understand and we're praying. There's a future exodus. We sense it. We sense if Yahweh's about to do something miraculous. He's about to gather his people back from the four corners where they've been scattered. And now he's beginning to remind us, in order to be a part of this company, in order to be part of this group, it's going to require us to learn to recognize these things, to learn to deal with this, to learn to deal with our flesh, to walk after the Spirit. Why? So that once again we can see the power. Once again we can see his authority in the earth. Now let's look a little bit further. In Leviticus 14 verse 1, this is when this Torah portion starts. After he spends a lengthy chapter teaching you about what to look for and what may cause leprosy, and it's more than just a skin affliction. Instead, we find that it has to do with things that we're entering into covenant with, things we're choosing to be joined to, seed planted that's bringing forth and affecting us. In Leviticus 14:1, he then tells you how to deal with it, how to cleanse it. It says, and Yahweh spoke unto Moshe, saying, this shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought unto the priest. And the priest shall go forth out of the camp, and the priest shall look and behold if the plague of leprosy be healed in the leper. And then it goes on to describe this process with the two birds, the cedar, the scarlet, the hyssop. And this process the leper must go through to be declared clean again. Let's look at this word for leper. It's Strong's number 6879, Zerah, and it means to be diseased of skin, to be leprous, to strike down, or a scourge. But there was an interesting side note when you look at this in the concordance. And the lexicon mentions that there's a connection between the two Hebrew letters, the Zadi and the Gamel. And so they make the connection that Zerah, leprosy, is connected to another word, Gera. And that this word means scab, scabbiness. Well, it kind of makes sense because we look back, oh, well, yeah, he says if there's a scab, they're looking for a scab. So there's this connection because it's a skin disease. It's a skin affliction. But when you go back and you begin to look at this word Gera, it's Strong's number 1639, and it means a lot more than just a scab. It can mean to diminish, to restrain. It can refer to scratch at something or to scrape it, leading to a scab or scabbiness, hence the connection to leprosy. But it can also mean to withdraw something, to take it away, to withhold something. It can refer to diminishing marital rights, diminishing the Torah or the law, and finally to remove or withdraw an inheritance. And so when you see these three things, there's three distinct areas that it seems as if maybe the languages of trying to teach you, these three areas will be affected when you choose to remain a leper. He's given you the ritual of how to cleanse yourself, but if you choose to remain in that state, if you choose to continue to allow these things to cross that threshold and entertain it and mess around with things that he's told you, these are the boundary lines, don't do it. These three areas become the areas that are affected. We find that it begins to diminish the marital rights. We find that collectively, aren't we the Kala, the bride of Messiah? That means that if I'm leprous, if I'm unclean, my marital rights are diminished. In other words, times that you're able to contact the king, your husband, and be intimate with him now begin to diminish. Why? You're unclean. You can't come into the presence of the holy Elohim. And so he's beginning to show you, if you continue to remain in this state, your marital rights begin to diminish. What's the rights of the bride? She has every right to have the ear of her husband. She has every right to be able to call upon him and he will answer her. She has every right to have all of her needs taken care of. She's supposed to be provided for, taken care of, not to have to worry about anything. She has every right to be able to walk in peace. These are her rights. And yet he's beginning to remind us that if you go over here and you begin to entertain these other counterfeits, if you're choosing to flirt around with this other seed, this other word, and allow it to come into the house, it's going to begin to diminish these areas. We find that it will also diminish the Torah, the law. Why? We're supposed to be walking this out, but our walk changes. Our Metzorah, what's being proclaimed, begins to change. And finally, it culminates with removing or withdrawing an inheritance. What should be rightfully ours now seems to pass us over. Now, as we continue to look at this, it's important to note that every time in the scriptures a specific reason is given for leprosy occurring, it deals with a challenge to the proper authority figure. And you'll find that there's several connections that the sages make regarding leprosy. It's connected to Lashon Hara, the evil tongue, but it's also connected to define authority. Not someone that thinks, I'm the dictator, I'm the head, not a Korah, but someone that's placed in that position by Yahweh himself and given that authority because he now represents Yahweh. He now represents the authority of the great king. And we find that every example where we're specifically told that this individual contracted leprosy and this is why, it's having to do with them bucking the authority of Yahweh. We see it with Miriam. She challenges Moshe. We see it with Gehazi. He was the servant of Elisha, given specific instructions, and he completely disregards it. And because of that, leprosy. Elisha was the prophet of Yahweh. We see it with King Uzziah. He challenges the priests who represented Yahweh in the earth, who were responsible for taking care of the temple. And he challenges them concerning the offering of the incense. The result is leprosy. And so when you begin to look at these examples again and again, we're being given these examples and it's beginning to show us leprosy now becomes this physical demonstration being used to teach us the results of challenging the king, demeaning him in our lives, diminishing his authority. And we may think, well, I would never do that. How would I would never. How do we do that? How do we diminish him? How do we cause his authority to be less than what it should be? How do we challenge Yahweh in our lives? And we find that he's going back and he's reminding us by not guarding the threshold, because this is his temple, this is his tabernacle. And the moment we're not guarding the threshold and we're allowing any manner of junk to come in this temple, we've now challenged his authority, his rights. And we find that when we allow the enemy to cross that threshold, when we don't guard what we are allowing to come in the house, it begins to diminish the role of his Torah, his word. It begins to diminish his marital rights as our husband. Why? Because instead of being able to go in and spend time in intimacy with him, we're in our flesh. And your flesh will hinder you from entering into the presence of the king. Isn't it interesting that we can go all day doing anything that we want, no problems. But the moment it comes time to enter into his presence, whether it be through praise and worship, whether it be through the hearing of the word of Yahweh, oh my goodness, it's so hard. Oh my, I'm tired. I can't keep my eyes open. Or I've got to go to the bathroom. I'm thirsty. There's something. I've got to do something. I've got to get out. I've got to move. I got to go to sleep. I can't keep my eyes open. I'm nodding. Do you see what he's beginning to teach us and show us? That it's this fleshly man that's going to hinder him in our lives. And if we want to see the power like they did in Egypt, if we want to see him move in these ways, it's going to require us to deal with this. Because when we can't even get our flesh under control enough just to enter in and be intimate with our husband, my goodness, how are we going to be the authority figure in the earth that's representing him? How are we going to be his helpmate, the one who is equal with him, the one that's able to bring his judgments, to cause his enemies to be made his footstool? We were not going to be able to, because we can't even control ourselves enough just to spend time with him. And we find this begins to be what he's showing us regarding this cleansing of the leper. It's dealing with your flesh. It's dealing with the thing that will rule over you. And he's reminding you, if you'll deal with this, if you'll cut this off, if you'll guard that threshold and begin to walk after the Spirit, cause your lifestyle to become something that's proclaiming the Torah, the word of Yahweh, then we can reach that level. Then we can be Israel. And we find that finally, if we don't, this culminates by us withdrawing and removing ourselves from the inheritance that he's bestowed upon us. Why? Because the Nachalah, the inheritance of Israel, whether they had it or didn't have it, was always a direct result of where they stood in covenant. That's why the land is so important. That land is their Nachaleh. It's our inheritance. Israel's removed from the land when they choose to not walk in covenant. So the moment they're cast out, they're understanding this process. You didn't guard the threshold. You didn't walk in covenant. You refuse to be intimate with your husband. And finally, the final lasting result is that they're now removed from their inheritance. In Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 11, we're told, "Wherefore, as I live, saith Yahweh, surely because thou hast defiled my sanctuary with all thy detestable things and with all thine abominations, therefore will I also diminish," Gerah, this word that's akin to leprosy, to diminish, to withdraw, to take away something, "I will diminish thee. Neither mine eyes spare, neither will I have any pity." When we look at this in Ezekiel, we immediately think, oh, he's talking about the temple. They're going to be removed from the land. They're going to be removed from the temple because they defiled that physical building. And yet he's reminding us here as we begin to look at the law of the cleansing of the leper, this is his sanctuary. This is his temple. This is his tabernacle, a sanctuary not built with human hands. And if we defile this sanctuary, if we bring any manner of detestable things in this sanctuary, and we allow all kinds of abominations to be allowed in this house, how much sorer a punishment, how much more will he be willing to cause us to be removed and cut off? And yet we find that he's reminding you that you don't have to stay in that state. You may have messed up and something may have been allowed to come across the threshold. You may have entertained that serpent at the tree when you weren't supposed to, yet that doesn't have to be the end, because there's a ritual. The leper can be cleansed. You can go through this process. You can choose to deal with it, to remove these areas that have affected your basar, and then you can be restored. Now, it's no accident when we look at this term, the title of this Torah portion is Metzorah. It's the root Sarah, but it has the mem prefix. Well, when you look at the way it's written, Metzorah, it's actually sharing the same three-letter root as Mitzrayim, Egypt. They both share the mem zadi resh. And so now we find once again this connection between Egypt and leprosy. Egypt literally becomes the house of the leper. And this is where Israel's been for 430 years. They've been in the house of the leper. They've been the ones that have been cast out of the inheritance, the stones that have been thrown into an unclean place. And we find that Israel, while they're in Egypt, they become so invested in Egypt that they allowed their thresholds to be compromised. In fact, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the name of Joseph is no longer known. And that's not just dealing with Pharaoh. Why does that Pharaoh not know and understand and respect who Joseph is? Because the descendants of Joseph no longer are representing and walking in the same power and authority that Joseph did. Amen. And so we find that while they're in Egypt, they become compromised. And we find that the role of Yahweh is diminished in their lives, and they neglect their inheritance. They neglect the Torah. And so now we can understand that directly before them coming out of Egypt at Passover, the blood has to be applied to the doorways because he's renewing that threshold covenant. This threshold's been compromised. So now the lamb has to be slaughtered. The lamb has to die now, representing the Messiah, so that this threshold can be cleansed and you can come out of this unclean house. And so we find they apply the blood to the doorposts of their homes. Yahweh enters now once again into this threshold covenant with them. The house is now cleansed and the relationship is renewed with their rightful husband. It's quite interesting because as long as that threshold remained remained uncleansed, remained compromised, Israel wasn't coming out of Egypt, because Pharaoh had every right to have access to them, because they had chosen to enter into covenant with him. They had chosen to allow Pharaoh and Egypt and all that it had to offer to compromise their thresholds. And we find that he had every right to have access, and so he had every right to keep them in bondage because they let him in the first place. And so we find that the thing that Yahweh does is he cuts off the access of Pharaoh to Israel. The thresholds restored, renewed, cleansed, and now Israel can come out because the very thing that he's holding over them, the very point of access he has, is now dealt with. As we continue to look at this, we find that Metzorah, this leprosy, has a numerical value of 400. Now 400 is a very important number. We find it quite a lot, and it's quite interesting. We're not going to go on that today, but 400 appears several times in scriptures. It's very prominent. Abraham buys the only piece of land that he actually buys for 400 shekels. Esau, coming to attack Jacob, comes with 400 men. All of this is dealing with the right that Israel has to their inheritance. All of this is dealing with the fact that that is Israel's. Yahweh gave that to them. And as long as they're walking in covenant, that's theirs. That's their right. Let's look a little bit further at this number 400. 400 is the value of the Hebrew letter Tav. The letter Tav represents a sign, a mark. It represents something that's sealed. It also can represent covenant. And yet now we see this Tav, this 400, connected with Metzorah, the leper. Do you think that maybe leprosy has to do with revealing where we stand in covenant? That he's using something physical that we see and that we can understand to teach us that this is actually symbolic of how he sees us in the spirit. That he's looking at the nation of Israel, and when they're in a leper state, it's literally declaring where they stand in covenant with him. It's also interesting because Abraham is told that circumcision would be a sign of the covenant. And we understand that circumcision represents dealing with the flesh. We're also told to circumcise our hearts. And if you would circumcise your flesh, if you would circumcise your hearts, literally walk after the spirit instead of after the flesh, it was an indicator, it was a sign, it was a mark that that individual walked in covenant with Yahweh. Leprosy, then, is it too much of a stretch to think that perhaps leprosy is a sign, a seal, pointing towards the fact that this individual is not? Let's look at this letter Tav a little closer. When you look at the Hebrew letter Tav, it looks as if it's written or composed with two other letters coming together and being connected. The Dalet and the Nun. The first leg and branch across forming the letter Dalet, and the final letter of the Tav coming down representing the Nun. Well, that's quite interesting because we understand that Hebrew letters are word pictures. The Dalet represents the door. The Nun represents the seed. My goodness, that's what we've been talking about this whole time. Inspecting the seed that comes across the door. Watching, making sure that there's a watchman at the door. Keeping the house clean. Making sure these things aren't allowed to come in. If you take Dalet Nun and you put these two letters together, they form the word in Hebrew Dan. It's the name of one of the tribes, but it means judge or judgment. You're responsible and charged with judging what comes across that threshold. You're responsible for judging what enters through the door. What seed are you going to allow to be planted? If you flip this Dalet Nun and form the word Nun Dalet, it forms the roots of the word Nod. It's familiar for most people because Cain was sent to wander in the land of Nod, Nun Dalet. Nod means a wanderer, wandering. If you continue to look, you'll find that it's also the root, Nun Dalet, of the word for Nidah, one that's unclean, one that's ritually impure. Oh my goodness, that's exactly what this Torah portion is dealing with, how to cleanse an individual that's Nidah, ritually impure, unable to come and have access to the tabernacle or Yahweh because of their unclean state. And now as we begin to look at this, we find that it's being connected to these letters, Dalet and Nun. And it seems as if the picture that he's beginning to teach us from his language is that counting on how well we have guarded the door, Counting on how we have inspected that seed that we allow to come in is going to in turn determine how we're judged. How much we've inspected that in turn is going to affect what our verdict is. Will our verdict be that we are still nidah, unclean, one who will wonder, or whether we're judged as one that's been cleansed and now can come back into the camp? It's interesting that when you look at this, when there's a suspicion of leprosy, it doesn't say that it is, but it's a suspicion. It might be. They've got the marks. They've got the scab. They've got that rising sore, and the priest inspects it. It looks as if maybe it might be leprosy. That individual is shut up for 7 days when they're suspected of leprosy. Well, isn't that interesting? Adam and Eve allowed the threshold to be compromised. They didn't inspect the seed. They allowed the serpent to plant in their garden. And we find they give him access, and we understand that literally they become lepers. Now, it affects their covering, doesn't it? They were naked and not ashamed, and after this happens, this encounter with the serpent, now they're ashamed. Something's changed. Their garment has changed. Their covering has now been compromised. They literally are now leprous. And what does Yahweh do? He puts them outside the camp. He puts them outside of the presence of Yahweh, outside of the garden. And we find that we're now in this process of being shut up for 7 days. In 1 Peter, we're told that 7 days is as a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. We've been shut up for 7,000 years. And we find that we're going to be inspected again by the priest when he returns to see. There was a suspect of leprosy. There was a suspicion that maybe there was leprosy in the house. We're shut up. We're sent out. And now we find that on the eve of the 7th day, the priest is coming back to inspect the one that was shut up. And we find that the priest is going to be looking to see the very ones that have been sent out for this 7 days, what state this garment's in now. Isn't it interesting that in the book of Revelation, he tells us that he's looking for a bride without spot or wrinkle? We so often think of a physical, the garment's dirty. It's got some dirt on it, or it's got some wrinkles. We didn't really take care of these garments. But now we can understand, maybe he's talking about, is there a spot in this bazaar? Is there a taint of leprosy? Is there a remnant that there's some things that we didn't deal with, that we're still being ruled and governed by our flesh, allowing the same thing to keep happening, allowing the same seed to keep being planted that would keep us in this cycle? But we find that he's looking for one that would be without spot, one that, having been shut up, understood that it's now time to be cleansed from this, to deal with this. Let's look a little bit further. 400, the value of Tav, the value of Metzorah, is also the value of another Hebrew word that leads us down another interesting train of thought. And it's Strong's number 7556, rakak, and it means to spit. Isn't it interesting? David started this off with saying that we're going to spit in the eye of the enemy. This word to spit is related to another word, yarak, their cognate roots, which also means to spit. But it's this word, yarak, that we see specifically connected with leprosy. In fact, you only see this word 2 times in the scriptures. And whenever I see something like this, I think, my God, what is up with this? I've got to inspect this. See, what does this mean? You see yarak first in Numbers chapter 12, verse 14, and it describes Miriam's encounter with leprosy. When she defies Moses and the cloud lifts up, she's leprous. And when they cry out on behalf of Miriam, Yahweh makes this statement: if her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed 7 days? Well, we understand she's leprous. For 7 days, she's got to be shut outside the camp, because that's the rule of leprosy. So that makes sense. But why this statement, if her father had but spit in her face, should she not be shamed for 7 days? Well, we need to look a little bit further, because obviously there's this connection. Yahweh specifically makes this statement. To be spit in the face is connected with being one that's leprous, one that has to be outside the camp. Well, let's look a little bit further, because we understand to be spit upon, it represents to shame someone. We have that same connotation today. You're shaming someone when we do this. Well, let's look a little further, because this term, yarak, to spit, that's used here, is used only one other time in the scriptures, and it's in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 9. And it seems as if these two instances are completely disconnected. Miriam goes against Moses. Lashon hara, rejects his authority. She gets leprosy. Deuteronomy 25:9 uses this word in this way. It says, "Then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders, and loose his shoe from off his foot, and spit in his face." Yurak. "And shall answer and say, So shall it be done unto the man that will not build up his brother's house." This verse was dealing with the concept of Levirate marriage, when the brother would die with no children, and his other brother would then take his wife to build his name. It's interesting because when we see this, we think, well, okay, well, that's kind of strange. Well, what does this have to do with coming out of Egypt? What does this have to do with being cleansed from leprosy? With learning how to walk after the Spirit and not after the flesh? With being a bride that's without spot or wrinkle? Well, let's look at this. To spit in the face was connected with loosing his shoe. We understand that shoes were symbolic. And when you study this, you'll now understand why this ceremony is taking place. Shoes, just like the soles of the feet, represented authority, ownership, possession. To remove the shoe represented that person was divesting themselves of a particular piece of property willingly. They were relinquishing all further claims to that piece of property. And now you can understand why this is happening in this context. That was his responsibility to take care of that wife, to build his brother's house. Yet he relinquishes all further authority. He relinquishes all possession and all ownership over that. And we find that the removal of the shoe at the end of the rite represented that the transaction was completed and legally binding. So now we need to plug this in. We're talking about to spit. It's connected with this concept of leprosy. Miriam gets leprosy, and it's as if Yahweh has spit in her face. The only other time we see this terminology is when the shoe is loosed and an individual is choosing to relinquish their authority, their ownership, their possession, completely be done with it. It's a done deal. The shoe's taken off. That's the final word. It's sealed. It's done. Let's look at this word loose. He's to loose the shoe. It's the word kalatz in Hebrew, Strong's number 2502, and it means to remove, to draw out or off, to withdraw. But then it also means to equip or arm for war, to be prepared for battle, to set free or to deliver or to spoil the enemy. And where things begin to get really interesting is that the first reference of this word kalatz is in this Torah portion in regard to leprosy. It says in Leviticus 14:40 that the priests were to take away, kalatz, the stones where the plague of leprosy were found concerning a house. Because when you begin to look at this, just because an individual got leprosy, that's not the end of it. A garment could have leprosy, and so could a house. So it seems as if when we begin to tie these points together, kalatz, the stones that have leprosy are removed. They're taken out. And it's the same analogy of the shoe being removed or taken off. Authority, possession being relinquished. Closing the deal, having nothing more to do with it, having any say-so over that taken away from you. It seems like, once again, it's pointing to the fact that where there's leprosy, there's an indicator that the threshold's been compromised. The authority, the control over the house, there's been a shift in power, so to speak. And we find that the enemy is in the camp. Isn't it interesting this term kalatz can also mean to prepare for battle, to arm for war? And who's to do this? The priests are to kalatz. The priests are to prepare for battle, to arm for war, to remove those leprous stones in order to set free and deliver the house from the enemy, to spoil the enemy. So we begin to see when he's talking about leprosy and he's talking about how to deal with this, the priest is to remove the stones that have become leprous. He's literally reminding them that the enemy, if there's a leprous stone in the house, it indicates there's been a breach. The threshold's been compromised. A seed's been planted that's going to reap forth a harvest that does not belong in the camp of Israel. And we find that he's beginning to tell the priests that their job is to deal with that, to remove those stones, to fight, to deliver the house from the what would happen from this. Do you think that maybe the next time we find ourselves in a position where the enemy is attempting to compromise the house, when he's attempting to cross the threshold, that maybe, just maybe, we would actually deal with it? We would actually prepare for battle, arm ourselves, and say, no, I'm not going to allow that. You're not going to take my inheritance. You're not going to cause this house to be compromised. You're not going to cause me to be unclean. That maybe there might be some different results. That maybe that when that person comes back that had leprosy, that maybe there's a cleansing that took place. That maybe those spots are gone because someone else is willing to stand in the gap and say, no, we're going to fight for the house. The enemy's not going to win this one. Do you realize that if we're not living in such a way that our lifestyle is proclaiming the good news of Torah, then it's an indicator the threshold's been compromised, and we become likened unto those leprous stones that have to be removed from the house. And we find that when these leprous stones are removed from the house, just like when that shoe's removed, it's symbolic that they have relinquished all further claims to that property. The transaction becomes complete and legally binding. They give up their inheritance and they're removed. Now you can see why Adam and Eve had to leave the garden. The moment the threshold's compromised and they, for all intents and purposes, become leprous, they forfeit their rights and claim to that position. The shoes removed. They now divest themselves of that property willingly. They relinquish all further claims to that role that they had. And we find that the enemy is able to usurp it. And now you can begin to see and understand why the enemy uses the same tactics. If he can seduce you to take and accept a counterfeit word, then you'll willingly forfeit your inheritance, your position, your authority, your power. You will willingly forfeit it because it's as if the shoe's been taken off. The moment those spots begin to appear, this individual is now indicated they're leprous. That stone's got to be removed. They've let go of their inheritance. They weren't willing to fight for it. And as we continue to look, we now understand this is why Yeshua came in the flesh. Here in Leviticus 14, verse 5, it tells us that 2 birds are to be taken for an individual that was a leper to be cleansed. The first bird had to be killed in an earthen vessel, and the second bird was allowed to be set free. It seems as if it's painting the picture of you and I. We're that leper. The sacrifice has to be killed in an earthen vessel. The Messiah has to come in the flesh. He becomes the bird in that earthen vessel that's killed, and the blood and the water flow, and that second bird, after it's dipped in it, is then allowed to go free, and the leper is cleansed. Do you think that maybe this is the shadow picture he's showing us? He comes in the flesh so you can be grafted back in and restored. We've willingly let go of our inheritance. We willingly allowed the threshold to be compromised. We found ourselves unclean, nida, a wanderer, cut off from the presence of Yahweh. And yet this ritual is here to remind us that there's one that came in an earthen vessel. There's one that chose to be the one that would be cut off for you so you can go free. And when we go through this process of being cleansed from leprosy, he's reminding us that this is not without a price. Guard the threshold. He's done everything that he has to do to restore you, to redeem you, to put you back. And now, once again, you have access to your inheritance. You have access to him. And yet we have the choice of what we'll do with it. Will we allow it to be compromised again, or will we fight for it? It's no accident that kalatz, loose, is composed of the same Hebrew letters that form the word kalatz, which means loins. The battle's over the seed line. Preserving the seed of the word of Yahweh is what we're fighting for. And we find that to become a leprous individual is painting the picture of one that didn't guard their loins, one that allowed themselves to become compromised. And we find that it was the responsibility of those in covenant to make sure the loins of the house were guarded, to make sure that it was the word of Yahweh that they would be planting and speaking forth. Now you know why leprosy is connected with Lashon Hara. It's symbolic of seed. What seed are you planting? It's evident of what's in here. If we're planting Lashon Hara, it's evident that this house is compromised. The wrong seed's here, and it's a battle between the 2 seed lines. Or are we speaking forth the word of Yahweh, the Torah, making it evident that this house, the loins of this house are guarded. The blood of the lamb's on this threshold. Amen. It's interesting that as much as we try to get away from this, it always goes back to this, the battle over the seed lines. Noah is a prime example of this. Noah was in covenant. Noah's a covenant keeper. His responsibility was to make sure the bloodline wasn't tainted. And because of that, Noah's found righteous. Noah receives grace in the eyes of Yahweh because he guarded the house. He made sure that no seed of the enemy was able to contaminate or compromise his house when everyone else chose to be compromised. And isn't it interesting that we're told by Yeshua himself that as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the days of the Son of Man. We find that once again, the enemy's whole goal is going to be to compromise that threshold, to compromise the house. If he can compromise Eve again, then he's already won. If he can compromise the helpmate, the one that's supposed to represent the king in the earth, if he can compromise your threshold, you now become lepers. And when the king comes back, where's the one without spot? Where's the one without wrinkle? What's the point of the sacrifice if the threshold gets compromised? And we find that Yeshua is admonishing us and reminding us that as it was in the days of Noah, what happened in the days of Noah? Every single household got compromised besides Noah's house. Noah had to be a pretty bad dude. He made sure that his threshold wasn't compromised, just like the priest, to prepare for battle, to go to war, understanding what's at stake. And we find that we're being reminded of the same thing. When we're dealing with this concept of leprosy, he's reminding you that this is just a manifestation of what it means to have your house compromised and what's at stake. Now let's look a little bit further. It may seem that these thoughts seem to be a little disconnected, but let's look a little further and see if he continues to branch these things together. We find that the first reference of leprosy, Sarah, is in Exodus 4:6, and it's Moshe at the burning bush. In Exodus 4, verse 1 through 8, we read of this encounter. And it's interesting because this is the first time you ever see the mention of leprosy. And the law of first reference comes into play. We're dealing with leprosy in this Torah portion. The first time it's mentioned is here at the burning bush. Whatever's taking place at this burning bush now is relevant and has effect on what we're dealing with in this Torah portion. In verse 1, it says, and Moshe answered. We find there's this conversation going on between him and Yahweh. And Yahweh's told Moshe, I'm going to deliver my people. I've heard their cry. And now we get to the answer from Moshe. It says, and Moshe answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, Yahweh hath not appeared unto you. And Yahweh said unto him, what is that in thine hand? And he said, a rod. And he said, cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moshe fled from before it. And Yahweh said unto Moshe, put thine hand and take it by the tail. And he put forth his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that Yahweh Elohim of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath appeared unto thee. Then he goes to the second sign. And Yahweh said furthermore unto him, put now your hand in your bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom, and he took it out, and behold, his hand was leprous as snow. And we find that when he puts it in back again, it's turned back. He's healed, and it's back to his other flesh. And then the statement is made, and it shall come to pass, if they will not believe you, neither hearken to the voice of the first sign, that they will surely believe the voice of the latter sign. When we see this, the first thing that we need to remember is that these signs were not for Egypt. These particular signs he specifically told are for Israel. Moshe says, they won't believe that you've spoken to me. They won't believe that it's time to come out of Egypt. And Yahweh gives him these signs. Show them these signs and they'll know. So then we have to ask, well, what do these signs represent? What message is he sending to Israel so that they would understand it's time to get out of the house of leprosy? It's time to quit being unclean, ruled by their flesh, and come out and begin to be Israel. What message was he sending them? First, let's look at the word for rod. The first sign was that he would throw down his staff, his rod, and it would become a serpent. And he would have to pick that serpent up by the tail, and it would become a rod again. The word rod is mateh, and it means a staff, a branch. But it can also mean tribe. It represents authority, power, strength, and it also is used to represent the tribes of Israel. So now we see this connection. This rod of Moshe is actually symbolically representing the tribes of Israel. And after all, this message is for them. what happens to this rod? It becomes a serpent. It's cast down. The word cast is shalak. It's Strong's number 7993, and it means to throw, to cast, to hurl, or to fling. It can also mean to cast lots. And we find that lots were cast to divide up the inheritance of the tribes in Joshua 18. So when we see this specific word being used to cast this rod down, the imagery that's being presented, they're being reminded of, is their inheritance. Lots were cast for their inheritance. It can also describe how individuals can be cast away because of their disobedience to Yahweh. It has the idea of something being cut down. And finally, once again, it's quite interesting because there's a connection to the Torah portion. In Leviticus 14:40, we're told, then the priest shall command that they take away the stones in which the plague is, and they shall lock those stones that have leprosy in them into an unclean place outside the city, outside the land. If we look a little further, the two-letter root of this word shalak is the shin lamed, and it means a grievous sin, one that's worthy of death, and it's used only concerning those who mishandled Yahweh. So this message that was being sent to Israel, as this rod is thrown down and it becomes a serpent, do you think that this message was a reminder that they had mishandled Yahweh? And because of that grievous sin, worthy of death, the tribes of Israel had become unclean stones. They had become leprous stones, and they were cast out of their inheritance into an unclean place, Egypt, the house of leprosy. And that literally this became their inheritance. That bondage that they had suffered for the last 430 years, that was their inheritance. That's what they had experienced. That's what they had every right to, because they chose to become unclean and to mishandle him. And yet he goes on to tell them that that staff isn't just going to lay on the ground as a serpent, but he's to take that serpent by the tail and it'll become a rod again. And so it seems if once they get this first message, you're unclean. You've been cast out into Egypt because you've mishandled me. Now he begins something. This is how you're going to remedy this. You're going to take that serpent and you're going to pick it up by the tail, and it's going to become a rod again. Amen. Let's look at this word take. It's Strong's number 270, akaz, and it means to grasp, to take hold, to seize, or to take possession. It's the root of akuza, also dealing with inheritance or possession, and it's the same word used to describe how they would take possession of their inheritance. The way you're going to take possession of your inheritance, the way you're going to be restored, you're cast out into an unclean place, but the way you're going to get back is by taking it by the tail. The word tail is zanab, and it means a tail, an end, a stump, but it's from the root meaning to cut off. In other words, the sign that Moses was to relay to the children of Israel was that for a time, Egypt, bondage, leprosy, a state of nidah, being unclean, had been their inheritance because they had mishandled Yahweh and become unclean stones cast away. Yet when Moshe arrives on the scene, the message that's being sent to them is that once again it's time to take back what rightfully belonged to them, to take possession and seize their inheritance. And the way they would do that, the way they would be restored, would be by cutting off the serpent that had compromised the house in the first place. Amen? And we find that the second sign was that Moshe's hand turned leprous and then healed. There's a connection between these two signs. He was showing them the remedy for leprosy. You're leprous. You're cast outside of your inheritance, outside of the promised land. You're in an unclean place. You're in the house of bondage, leprosy, Egypt. But the way that you're going to be healed and made whole is when you choose to cut off the serpent that continues to compromise the threshold. And we find that Israel will be made whole. They'd be brought back from their wandering when they chose to cut off this serpent from compromising the threshold instead of relinquishing their claims, choosing to do battle instead and protect it. Isn't it interesting, though, as we continue to look at this, directly before Moshe is given these signs, he's told another statement by Yahweh. He's told to remove his shoes. In Exodus 3:5, it says, "Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thy stands is holy ground." Outside of this, we've always thought it's a sign of respect. It's holy ground. He has to remove his shoes. But yet now as we begin to look at this, to remove the shoe symbolic. The shoe has to do with possession, authority, ownership. Do you think that maybe there's something more happening here? Let's look at the language. Put off your shoes. The word put off is nashal, and it means to slip off, to drop off, to clear away entirely, or to clear away completely. The term is later used to describe how the nations would be dispossessed and cast out before the Israelites. So we find this term nashal deals with dispossession, releasing a claim to something. Then the word shoes, na'al, a sandal, a shoe. We understand, because we looked at it earlier, that transferring a domain, it was customary symbolically to deliver a shoe because it represented a transaction. They no longer had authority over that piece of property. They now transferred the shoe to someone else. Hence, the casting down of a shoe upon any country was a symbol of taking possession, because wherever the soles of your feet touch, that's your inheritance. But yet here we find that Moses is told to remove his shoes, to completely clear away any possession, any rights, any claims that he had prior to this encounter. Do you think that the pattern that he was showing Moshe and teaching him was that for Israel to be delivered, for them to come out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and the same goes for you and I today, that the first step in delivering them and restoring them would have to do with us being willing to let go of our previous claims, our possessions, our inheritance that we've acquired in Egypt when we walked after the flesh, and instead release that and choose to embrace what Yahweh wants to give us and do, and to become a group of individuals that would begin to walk after the Spirit. Moshe's told, remove your shoes. What you've had in the past, that's not your inheritance. The house of bondage is not what I have for my people. That's not yours. Remove the shoe. Release the claims. Let Egypt keep the leprosy. Let Egypt keep the uncleanness. And we find that when they would do that, when they would release their possessions in Egypt and choose now instead to do what Yahweh had told them to do, that would be the first step in their deliverance. And as long as they were willing to walk this out, they would continue to see his power and his authority in their lives as he continued to pour out his inheritance that he had for them upon them. And we find that when that happens, when once again Israel chooses to let go of everything we've held on to so tightly because we thought that's all there was, when we choose to let go of all the bondage that we've been experiencing, well, you know, it's uncomfortable, but it's mine. It's familiar. All this stuff that I've been toting around all these years, when we finally choose to lay it down and release it, then and only then will Israel once again become a force to be reckoned with, because there is a mind change that takes place. Now they understand that's not my inheritance. That's something the enemy vomited out upon me and made me think that's what belonged to me. But that's not what belongs to me. Yahweh has better plans for his people. Amen. And it's going to have to do with us choosing to come out and be cleansed from our leprosy and become that bride without spot or wrinkle. And in turn, she'll become an entity to be reckoned with. And once again, the fear is going to fall upon all surrounding nations, because they'll know, yes, surely Yahweh is with them. Amen.
Good word. It's kind of amazing to me when we look at all these patterns and shadows.